Watson from Pro Social Work, and CJ Sorenson, who wrote an article that Matt and I recently discussed here on the podcast. And so CJ was nice enough. Actually, Matt realized that he maybe had a little bit of an in to contact CJ, and he agreed to come and discuss his article, the title of which is "The In-Class Experience of Social Work Students Based on Their Political Ideology." And so CJ, I'm going to let you introduce yourself real briefly. And if you would, tell us a little bit from your perspective. We already covered your article, but from your perspective, a little bit about how you came to research this and write about it.
Okay, great. Hello to both of you. It's great to be with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm CJ Sorenson. I have been a social worker through my whole education. I earned a BSW and then an MSW, and recently in December graduated with a doctorate in social work from Tulane University.
Congratulations.
For the last 12 years, I've been a clinical professor of social work at Utah State University, and just recently changed employment and am now living in Europe.
Well, congratulations on finishing up your PhD. That's no small thing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so
and she's actually your advisor is actually a co-author on this paper, right?
That's right.
And we're hoping maybe we can have a conversation with her too.
Yes, Dr. Tiffany Jones is an expert research methodologist and statistician, so she helped a great deal with that aspect of the work. So you asked about how this paper came to be. So as part of my doctoral work, I was contemplating what to do for a project, and as a clinical professor in social work, it was fairly common that students would approach me, often privately and quietly, and say, "Hey, Professor Sorenson, I'm feeling some angst about my social work education experience. Here's what I'm hearing in the classroom, and here's where I stand politically. And how do I make sense of that and reconcile it?" And so as I was thinking about topics that interest me and that I wanted to learn more about, this topic was at the forefront of my mind. What is the experience of students who are more politically conservative in the context of social work education? That's how the study came to be.
So we read it with, I guess, as even Matt, even though Matt's not in the classroom much, he was like, "This does not surprise me." Did it surprise you at all that so many students were, I guess, left-leaning, number one, that, a preponderance,
Mm-hmm.
and that many seem to have reported that they came to social work almost because of that ideology. Did that surprise you at all?
Not really. From my own experience in social work education, and then in my experience as a social work educator, anecdotally, I sort of knew that was the case, even though I didn't have all of the data that this study helps us to have more clarity around.
I did have a question too. I think that you say here that you also collected qualitative data, that you had open-ended questions also. Mm-hmm. And Matt and I both were like, I wonder what happened to that data. Is that a forthcoming analysis?
Yeah, that will depend entirely upon my time. But there is a lot of qualitative data there that I would love to take a look at and analyze, or have somebody else take a look at and analyze, because I think it could add really important and rich information to the quantitative data that we have.
So I don't think, I mean, I don't know, Matt, is there anything in, sort of looking at this article, is there anything in the lit review or the intro that you feel like you want to ask about?
No, I think and maybe it'd be helpful for you to share some of your findings and so forth, but I'll just say that it didn't surprise me because I've been searching, looking for articles and information on political and viewpoint diversity in social work practice and education for the last 5 or 6 years, and there is a relative dearth of information. Some of that may be because it's quite self-evident that most social workers do lean politically left, and may not make a lot of sense for some people to study that when it's quite obvious. But I think there are definitely some things that I really appreciated from your article that highlight some things that I think educators could do to really make a difference and to help expand the influence of social work. So I think it'd be really interesting for you to just share and summarize your findings here, and when Elizabeth, when you feel it's appropriate.
Oh yeah, I mean, I just there's nothing really super surprising in your lit review. That, again, just like Matt said, people haven't done this much. When they have done it, this is what they found. This is what I expect to find. I do think that you point out in your introduction, actually even before your lit review, that that there might be a danger associated with, and you kind of alluded to that when you said students sometimes would come to you and say, you say on the one hand there may be a danger of appearing politically neutral and thereby creating a sense of false equivalency between opposing arguments on important issues. On the other hand, some have expressed concern that enabling a political echo chamber or reinforcing political hegemony in social work is problematic for the professor and for society more broadly. So you kind of set up your project here. Before we get to your results, which I agree, I want you to summarize, I do sort of want you to describe your method real quick first, because you use a scale, you create an aggregate, and we don't have to get into the whole, alteration that you did, but there was overwhelming, I shouldn't say overwhelmingly, because I could be wrong, but you do mention that most people are having a good experience, that the data was skewed toward having a good experience. So we should start, there. But if you would describe your method a little bit. Yeah. How did you go about doing this study?
Yeah, sure. And if let me just say a quick word about kind of the lit review, as the two of you have already mentioned, there's been kind of a dearth of research around this, but I think more important than just the numbers is the experience of those small numbers of students, right? Like, what are they experiencing in the social work classroom? Because we all know they're a minority of students, but what's it really like for them? And the few studies that have been done over the past, 15, 20 years really bore out that it's a difficult experience for them, that they're dismissed and marginalized and sometimes shamed and judged, oftentimes take on inauthentic views to sort of get through. But those were largely smaller scale qualitative studies, sort of targeted in one institution or a few institutions.
But as you point out, it's difficult from the professorial side also, because you don't want to. We'll just take something kind of flat earthers. Okay, so we have a flat earther in the classroom, and we don't want to give too much airtime, right, to the flat earther. And there's this balance, right? And I think sometimes, and professors also, maybe I'm in the minority, but I think historically we have wanted to appear neutral. We don't want to reveal our, political ideology or whatever. We want students to feel comfortable. Again, at the same time, it's a difficult balance because we don't want to entertain, there in the marketplace of, we should let the marketplace of ideas sort of decide what's, what's more true. At the same time, in the marketplace of ideas, there are some bad ideas, so
Yeah,
so
right.
it is difficult. And I do think that, I mean, again, maybe I'm wrong, but I think in my time as a professor, I have seen this change from the goal to appear neutral to the goal to appear progressive.
Mhm.
And I do see that as a change in the in just sort of in the air. It's like in the air that we're breathing now, that we're supposed to appear more progressive. So
Right.
so I
Yeah, and
think that studies like yours give us more motivation to go back to move forward towards a more neutral stance. But that's my perspective.
yeah, and I think that in the literature review, it was interesting to find a handful of kind of more editorial articles that addressed this tension that exists and where we should go as educators to address these very kinds of things that you're talking about.
So go back to telling us about your method.
Yeah, okay, so the methods. I sent a survey out, a 27-item survey that was mixed methods, so it had quantitative and qualitative aspects to it. Sent it out to 89 different public institutions across the United States to try and capture every region of the country. 31 of those institutions agreed to distribute it in some way to their students, and I got responses from 30 of those. It was an anonymous survey that people completed through Qualtrics, and was open for several weeks, and then we analyzed the data from there.
So you had it was a standardized scale that looks like it has like 13 items on it, of which you used 11 or something like that. Am I getting
Yeah, that's right. So 11 of those 27 items became a composite score to
really
represent classroom
yeah,
experience.
right. I want to give you like more credit than you're giving yourself. So, because of the 27 items, you're including not just this scale, you're including all the questions that people asked, right?
Yep,
Okay.
all the
That people were
demographic
asking.
information,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yes.
So this scale that was originally 13 items, did items 12 and 13 not just they weren't reliable? They did not improve the reliability of the aggregate. Is that the deal?
So we actually never intended for those to be part of the composite score.
Okay.
We wanted to evaluate those separately. Those 11 items that form the composite score had really good inter-item reliability. So lots of correlation among those 11 items.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure, because the way that I read it was that I wasn't sure. So, and again, most people were having a fairly good experience, or reported were having a fairly good experience in their, in their graduate school, in their classrooms. And so then you went on, you did a little, because when data is skewed like that, you have to do a little statistical gymnastics in order to make the distribution more normal, so that you can do the analyses that you did. This is very common. People do transformations all the time. So then this is where we get to the meat of the findings, right? So what did you find after you created your aggregate score for classroom experience, and you have your variables for conservative liberal leanings, what you had, how voting, how people voted, then just a question how right or left leaning you are, and then whether you're a Republican or a Democrat registered or immigrant.
Yeah, so maybe for the audience, we'll clarify here that the composite score ends up being the dependent variable. And then the independent variables we looked at primarily were political philosophy, so conservative, liberal, progressive, moderate, or other, and then political party, Democrat, Republican, independent, or other, and then 2020 presidential vote. And to give just a quick idea about what some of those 11 items were on the composite score of classroom experience, it's things like, it's a Likert scale, five point Likert scale. Do you feel comfortable in the social work classroom when discussing things that intersect with politics? Do you feel emotionally safe, physically safe? Do you ever feel judged or shamed by classmates? Do you ever feel judged or shamed by the instructor? Do you feel like the atmosphere is conducive to expressing alternative viewpoints? Do you feel like your instructor's open to opinions other than their own? Those are the kinds of things we were asking on that 11-item scale.
And can you tell us what you found?
Yes. So with respect to political ideology, we found that conservative leaning students were much more likely to have negative experiences in the classroom, whereas liberal progressive students were much more likely to have positive experiences in the classroom. We found that Republican students were more likely to have negative experiences in the classroom. And we found that Trump voters in 2020 were much more likely to have negative experiences in the classroom.
So now you do say that, I think you sort of summarized, the most significant predictor of negative classroom experience is the perception that one's own political beliefs were incompatible with social work. And so I kind of want to, we talked about another article, Matt and I talked about another article, where basically the authors were arguing that that's okay. They don't say it, I'm definitely paraphrasing here, okay? But basically that would be okay because social work is a progressive, social justice oriented career, profession, avocation, and that people should sort of come around to that in order to be really good social workers. That maybe even it's in that article that social work programs should be gatekeepers for people who don't fit. So your argument is that maybe we should do some things to make the environment more comfortable for people with diverse viewpoints. The other paper, the authors were arguing that we need to ensure that people do embrace the progressive nature of social work, because that's basically what makes social work, social. That's what they're, that the social justice aspect needs to be reinforced and that people need to embrace that.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of thoughts that I have about that. And I'll first go back to these students who would come to me, who I knew on a personal level. And these were well-meaning, intelligent, compassionate, capable, skilled students who were equipped in every way to be effective social workers. And so that seems a little bit problematic to me, to insist that someone must be liberal, progressive politically to be an effective social worker. And so I argue that perhaps we should enlarge the tent, and that there could be some real benefits in having ideological diversity for our profession. The second point I would make is that even if the goal is to get all of the students to come around to a liberal progressive ideology, is the method through judgment and shame and marginalization, or is it through logical and compassionate persuasion? And I think that the latter would probably be more effective than what some of these students are reporting they're experiencing.
So, CJ, tell us a little bit about, you emphasize the importance of critical pedagogy. And so we'll be a little critical here and invite you to kind of have a dialogue and do our best to challenge and invite different viewpoints in here. What would you say to someone that might suggest that these students of yours, maybe your study finds that they're uncomfortable? Is that evidence of their own fragility? Maybe they haven't been exposed to alternative viewpoints before. Maybe their introduction to differences is creating some challenges for them.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and maybe an important point. Like, discomfort in and of itself may not be problematic. In fact, it may be a really good thing to push us, out of our comfort zones and to learn and grow. I certainly have experienced that in my own educational process, and it's been a very positive thing, even if at times it's produced some angst. So discomfort by itself is not necessarily a problem. Maybe that does reflect on some fragility of a student, or maybe it just reflects that they're kind of pushing the boundaries of what they know and understand and have experienced. But when we take all of the data together, that these students are also reporting that they feel judged and shamed, now we're in a different kind of territory, right? And when they talk about not feeling physically safe, that was another kind of surprising thing to me, that students are reporting not feeling physically safe. That's another indicator that this isn't just about fragility. There's an atmosphere being created in the classroom that shuts people down, and they end up, by their report in this study, hiding what they think and feel, and just taking on whatever they think is expected so that they can get through. And that doesn't serve anyone, in my view. That's not good for the student. It's not good for the profession. And so I would push back on that idea that this is just about fragility.
Was it only conservative students who identified a lack of intellectual or ideological or political or physical safety in the study?
Not necessarily. Now, of course, we took all of those items and we averaged them together and then ran the analysis. So it's hard to parse out exactly. Mm-hmm. But let me just give you one example. So on the item, do you feel like the atmosphere is conducive to expressing alternative points of view? Mm-hmm. About 60% of the sample identifies as liberal, progressive, and or a Democrat. But on that particular item, when we asked that question, 50% of the respondents said sometimes or less. Sometimes, rarely, or never. So that's a pretty significant chunk of the students, close to or just above a majority of students, who at least sometimes don't feel like the environment is conducive to expressing alternative views, which by the numbers would have to include some of those liberal progressive students or Democrat students who, by assumption, would always feel comfortable when it comes to political.
And to be fair, this is what most surveys of students have been finding. More and more students feel that they, are self-censoring in the classroom, regardless of their political orientation. Students are just feeling vulnerable and uncertain about, and it's not just about their professors, it's about other students feeling like maybe someone would post something about them, or say something rude after they left, or who knows what. So this is, again, to be fair, this is pretty universal across undergrad, graduate students, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Pew survey, the Heterodox survey, the FIRE survey, we could go on. They're finding more and more that students are self-censoring.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to highlight. I think it would be really interesting to learn more about which factors are at play here that most influence this kind of experience for students. Because when we asked about do you ever feel judged or shamed by your instructor, it was actually lower than the response by other students. So that's pretty interesting. And what factors exactly are creating this feeling for students, or what combination of factors exactly are contributing to this? Because of course my study is all just correlation, right? We're not looking at causation at all.
And again, so we don't know. I mean, there's, again, we're breathing more than academic air, right? There's like all the rest of what's going on in society. And certainly we're finding this. So you do say, identifying as straight and Christian were associated with higher reports of negative experiences. So it's not just about political affiliation. It's not just about how you voted, but also straight and Christian, which there are plenty of left-leaning Christians and plenty of left-leaning straight people. So, and by the way, I thought I was surprised at the large percentage of your respondents who were LGBTQ plus, right? So 37.1%.
Right.
Versus the population, of 7.1%. So I guess, if you could speak to either one of, either or both of those with regard to sexual orientation and, religiosity.
Yeah, so I did a companion study with the same data on religious affiliation and faith, and found very similar findings that folks who identified as religious were more likely to have negative experiences in the social work classroom. And when we kind of broke that down into small groups, it was Muslims, followed by Catholics, followed by Latter-day Saints who experienced the most negative kind of experience. But the numbers were pretty small. For example, there were only 4 Muslims in the study. So we combined groups together into all Christian sects, other, and then none or atheist. And the data bore out that Christians were most likely to have a negative experience in the classroom. With respect to LGBTQ+, I was also surprised by that data. When I looked further, though, into the breakdown by generation, it's 7.1% of the general population. But when you start to look at millennials and then Gen Z, those numbers really start to grow. And so the high numbers here may be reflective of just a younger population. And that's my best.
Although you're the average age was 30.
Was
right?
30.
That was
Mm-hmm.
so. I was just looking to see how many Christian. Let's see, what's the? Oh, I don't have the right page. I don't know what percentage of your respondents.
Yeah, it's about 47% identify as Christian, and 39% identify as none or atheist.
Do you recall, I'm asking you a really picky question here, so you may not remember. Do you remember the correlation between political affiliation and Christianity? Was it strong, or was it, because now you got 50%, so probably not as strong, right? Not very.
Right. I don't recall exactly. Yeah. But I mean, there's lots of data out there that correlates political affiliation and philosophy with religious affiliation and commitment and that kind of thing.
But still, you've got 50% of your population identifying as Christians, or
right.
Of your specific population. So clearly, those were not all conservatives, because you don't have that many.
Right.
You don't have 50% conservatives. So
right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there were plenty of. So it's just interesting. I think that it wasn't just the political orientation; it was also the religiosity. And I do think that as a professor, I of course I teach psychology, I teach statistics and research methods and cognition. So I don't, like religion very seldom comes up. Maybe a student will give, suggest an example. I'll say, well, think of something you'd want to study, and they maybe think of something like how often people go to church, something
mm-hmm.
like that. So we make up a little, research example, but I don't necessarily, unless you're a philosopher maybe, or a historian, I don't know how much religion even comes up. And so it bothers me that if I'm not even talking about religion in my class, that students who, identify, with a religion feeling, might feel, again, a need to self-censor or something. So what are some of the things that you think we could be doing, that I could be doing in my own classrooms,
Yeah. I certainly don't agree with everything that Paulo Freire has to say, but those ideas of critical pedagogy are really interesting to consider. To be focused on more of a bottom-up approach, a dialogic approach, one that focuses on collaboration instead of indoctrination, instead of authoritarian depositing of certain dogmas that a student needs to accept in order to be a good whatever, in this case, social worker. I think social work has a set of core values, and 95% of the respondents in this survey said that social justice, as an example, was a value that resonated with them. But there's clearly different definitions of what that means and different methods about how it can be achieved. And I think there's value in having dialogue about that. Like, that makes all of us better. That refines our perspective when we can have some really engaging conversation about what this looks like and how we bring it about. There needs to be some push-pull. And so I see, as educators, one of our roles is to help facilitate that kind of intellectual engagement and conversation in respectful and collaborative and cooperative and compassionate ways.
So why not pursue things through a progressive lens, where progressivism tends to dominate, as Elizabeth mentioned, and to the degree that many are self-censoring? Why not encourage that self-censoring? Why would you want to spend all this time talking back and forth about different ways to pursue social justice? Why not just embrace progressivism?
Yeah. Well, let me be clear that I don't have a problem with anyone, individually embracing progressivism. But I think we run into problems when we create echo chambers. And echo chambers inevitably are going to lead to deafness around certain kinds of tones and experiences. And I come from a state with lots of rural communities, with conservative religious people, and they need social work too. And they might be best served by social workers who know and understand their culture and their way of life and can relate to them. And so I think that if we just say social work must be this, we run the risk of actually doing harm in the long run, because there's nothing challenging that perspective. There's no one saying, whoa, let's pull on the reins here. Heaven knows that the helping professions have done a fair amount of damage over the years by quickly embracing some or other idea. And I think we increase the likelihood of doing something like that when there's not ideological diversity. And then the second point, just to highlight it, is what about all of these communities and peoples and places who are in desperate need of social workers, who can do an extraordinary job and may not hold politically progressive or liberal ideas?
So what would that look like? If how can somebody's personal conservatism align with social justice, with service, with dignity and worth of the person, with the importance of human relationships, with competency, with integrity? How can somebody who's a traditional conservative, how can they practice social work?
Yeah. Well, they're out there and they're doing it. I know personally wonderful social workers, including former students who are politically conservative.
Well, what are they doing?
They're doing clinical work. Is that what you mean? Like, what kinds of things are they doing? Yeah, they're case managers, they're clinicians, they're administrators, and they embrace those core values that you just named of social work: service, integrity, competence, the importance of human relationships, dignity and worth of the person, and social justice even. Social justice might be the most tricky one, because there's some real conflict maybe around how is it defined and what are the methods to achieve it. But I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as a healthy thing.
Healthy in what way? How is that healthy?
Well, again, I think a rush to any particular policy, for example, has unintended consequences. When we talk about policy in social work education, we talk about unintended consequences, but we don't often really implement the thoughtfulness of trying to evaluate that. And so where a liberal progressive might have a real fire in their belly to push something forward and change something. And a conservative might say, "Ooh, I don't know about that. Maybe we should keep doing what's been done, or maybe there's some value in what's been done." That kind of tension and push-pull is healthy for our profession, and it's healthy for our democracy, in my opinion.
So dialoguing across differences, being able to articulate fairly and accurately the potential unintended consequences of your conservative beliefs is critical for a social worker to do. Or being able to articulate the unintended consequences of your progressivism is an important thing to do. But really being able to say, this is what I believe would be best, but having some awareness of those unintended consequences.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, shouldn't we challenge all of our own ideas and other people's ideas? And I mean challenge in a thoughtful way, not in an angry, violent way, but I think it's good for ideas to be challenged and to be thought through. That's good for policy making. It's good even clinically. We jump on bandwagons and
Sure.
And then we find out a few years later that it wasn't so good after all.
So is critical pedagogy how does it relate to orthodoxy? Can you present an ideologically orthodox approach, as we see now within progressivism in some arenas? Can you do that in the context of critical pedagogy, or are they mutually exclusive?
I think that they're mutually exclusive. I'm not an expert on critical pedagogy per se, but the idea is a critique of traditional pedagogy, which is more authoritarian, right? Like, this is the way it is, and this is the way it's supposed to be, and this is how you do it. These are Freer talks about the dogmas and doctrines that get deposited into students that are viewed as empty vessels, and they need to do it that way from the authoritarian instructor. And his ideas in critical pedagogy are, maybe that's not a great approach. Okay. There should be dialogue, and there should be diversity, and there needs to be student contributions to the conversations.
Right. So from your perspective, social workers can take a look at what are the norms, what is happening in our culture, in our world, and recognize the functional ability of that. But there's also people on the margins for whom that does not work.
Right.
Those for whom they don't have a voice, the world is kind of clicking along, and social work needs to keep them in mind as well, in addition to the things that seem to be functioning, or for whatever reason, people's or a culture's values, norms, those kinds of things. Are you aware, or if we were to pursue a progressive ideology, is there a way that say we could create a world where everyone is equal, everyone has equal access to resources, that that we have equality of outcomes, where we just don't have people on the margins?
That's a big question, and I can't predict the future, but I think that would probably be unlikely. I do think that I sort of have this idealistic hope and vision that social workers, who are oftentimes called healers, could play more of a role in helping communities and society to become integrated instead of fragmented. Because in my view, just like clinically, if there's fragmentation inside an individual, it's a sign of trauma, right? It's a symptom of wounding. And that's what our communities and society look like right now. And I would love for social workers to lead the way instead of promoting fragmentation by focusing on some of the things that we're presently focused on, to lead the way in helping communities heal and integrate. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be people who continue to struggle and suffer and who are marginalized, but it's a constant call for us as social workers to be involved in the work of healing and pursuing peace.
So if that is the case, one of the things in our conversation with the other author, who was encouraging embracing progressivism and more that social work education should embrace a certain ideology of progressivism. We asked specifically, why not encourage dialoguing across differences? Why not encourage, or respect different moral foundations, that there, people come to the table with different moral foundations. If you apply moral foundations theory, for example, where there's care, there's fairness, there's liberty, loyalty, authority, sanctity. People, come to the world with, or they experience their world through different moral foundations. We asked, why not just respect some of those differences and allow for differences among social workers? And my recollection, Elizabeth, you can help me with this, but my recollection was his response was, well, that's a nice ideal, but in reality,
we should do it.
Yeah.
But we should do it, but, or we should do it and, right? That yes, there should be dialogue and people should be encouraged to move towards, a progressive, beliefs or endorse progressive programs, because that's the dominant, in social work, that's the dominant, I don't want to say it's the dominant ideology, because it isn't just that, right? The way that it's described is that it's part of what social workers do. It's part of what social work policies are. It's social work ethics, all of that. So it's not ideology necessarily. It's that progressivism is at the core of what social work is, and that must be embraced in order to be a good social worker. And in fact, Matt, you also even went one step further, and you asked about a few places where someone might be placed. And I guess I would even flip that around and say, is someone who is, say, Christian, maybe doesn't believe in, certain, that there's more than two genders, and those, and gets placed somewhere, let's flip it, gets placed, say, in a large city where there's a lot of young people, and can someone who is, identifies as Christian and maybe more right-leaning, can someone be an effective social worker? Would that be, in an area like that? Or, yeah, so could they do the social justice work, the social work that's required of them in that particular area?
Yeah, I think that the social work values and code are sort of the guide, and one of those is that we would not impose our values on to a client. So if they can honor any client and every client as a person with dignity and worth, and engage in a relationship of positive regard and trust with that person, and assist them with their needs without imposing their personal values onto that client or client system, then I think that they can be an effective social worker. And I think social workers are doing that all the time. You know, we pull out some of these hot button issues, but there's always conflicts of values between a social worker and a client in some way, shape, or form. And we have to just be aware of those and decide how we're going to engage the client based on those differences. But I don't think it should be then prohibitive of someone being called a social worker.
So let's just ask you specifically about social work education, and should a site that is in a rural area, that is a homeless shelter, it's the only one, say, in the county or the municipality. There's no other sites there. They're run by a Christian organization who believes in sex within the context of marriage, and does not want people in their homeless shelter engaging in sexual activity with somebody who's not their spouse. Should a site like that, should they be able to be a site, a social work education site, a practicum site? Would it be appropriate for a Christian organization like that to be a site where social worker students can be placed?
I think so. Yeah.
Let me take it one step further. They require the residents or the people who come into their facility to declare their faith, their belief, or their acceptance in Jesus Christ as their Savior and Redeemer. And in order to go into that site, they have to declare their faith. It needs to be, in other words, it's a homeless shelter for Christians, and it discriminates against Muslims, Buddhists, atheists, and others.
Yeah, I mean, the context of that agency is very specific. And by law, as far as I understand the law, they are allowed to do that. And so I was involved in practicum placements. I mean, that was part of my role in the university where I worked. And so
this is a perfect question for you then.
I mean, obviously we would want to make sure that the students are aware of the context of that agency so that they can feel comfortable, because we wouldn't want to put a student into that situation where they wouldn't feel comfortable, and supportive understanding of those policies. But it would not mean that a social work student shouldn't be placed there as a very specific kind of faith-based organization that has certain kinds of rules and policies for the services they provide.
Okay. So again, you would be open to expanding social work placement opportunity as long as the student goes in with informed consent, understands what it is.
Yeah, and that agency is abiding by, reasonable laws and policies. If
Sure.
an agency is inappropriately discriminating with no legal standing to do that, then that's a different conversation.
Gotcha. Okay. Very good. Elizabeth, other thoughts or comments?
Well, one thing is I laughed about this with you mentioned that that only 35% of the variance is explained by your, basically your aggregated score.
Yeah.
And a couple of other, a couple of variables explain the aggregated score. And I think you should celebrate that. You sort of wave it away as like, oh, only 35% of the variance. But what you have is basically one or two variables explaining 35% of the variance. And I think that does speak to, granted, there's, a lot of variance left over, right? But that does speak to, like, if you could explain 35% of the variance and, who survives cancer, you'd be pretty darned excited, right? So it feels to me like something that is doable to move the needle, to expand viewpoint diversity in the classroom, to, as you say, broaden the tent, right? To facilitate more comfort, honesty, reduce self-censorship. Again, as we mentioned, like this is across the board, right? That really students are self-censoring. It feels like a small thing. A small thing that professors can try to do. There's a lot, to get to your critical pedagogy thing, there's a lot of work out there. I said work, not research, but as you point out, sort of like editorializing more about critical pedagogy and making sure that you include, say, authors that are female, authors that are, non-traditional gender, different races and that kind of thing. One thing I've noticed is that students don't notice when you do that. So students are more interested in how many pages is the article. They don't even notice when it's an easily identifiable female name. They certainly don't know whether a person with a more ethnic sounding name is male or female. What nationality, race, religion, ethnicity they might be. So beyond sort of that, so, this sort of, as you mentioned, sort of this idea, this oppressive, authoritarian kind of material, which the other author that we interviewed made a point multiple times that the content that's covered in classrooms and the structure of universities is very authoritarian, and traditional and all that kind of thing. I don't know that I agree. I'm not saying I agree with all of that. But what can we do beyond sort of trying to expose people to, readings maybe? We've talked a lot about this dialogue. What does facilitating dialogue look like in a social work classroom, for example? So how can you actually make that happen? And, can we like sort of, narrow it down a little bit? What might that look like in sort of the context of your normal job that you're already doing? We're not reinventing all of the curriculum, throwing out our entire syllabus. We're, trying to broaden the tent in the course of our regular job.
Yeah. I think maybe modeling, as social work educators and or supervisors, we end up doing quite a bit of modeling for our students. And I just think, what are we modeling for students if in the context of a classroom, we say, are there any other views about this. And when someone expresses it, to receive it with thoughtfulness and with compassion, and to engage in a conversation about it. And there can be modeling of intellectual curiosity and cultural humility and democracy, right there in that little micro interaction between a professor and a student, that the other students observe and see that, oh, this is how this can play out in the real world, and we can make some movement towards more collaboration and cooperation and community.
That's great, CJ. I would agree with that. The social work is oftentimes a process, not necessarily a destination. It's more of an orientation that we take of dialoguing and modeling that, and certainly appreciated how you've modeled that, and accepted some questioning and some ways where you could reflect how social workers can adopt different viewpoints and or come from different perspectives and be quite effective. And I would agree that modeling is critical. So thank you for doing that today.
You bet. Thank you.
And we're very appreciative of your article, and we're happy that it got published.
Yeah.
Me too. I was very pleased.
Yeah.
Yes.
CJ, can you tell us a little bit, just from your perspective, for people trying to be pro-social, to dialogue across differences, to seek to humanize others regardless of their political beliefs or ideology, that are willing to stand on ethical principles, the ethical principles that we just discussed. That's what we would say is pro-social, but I'd be interested in your own definition. What does it mean to you to be pro-social?
I think it means, to me, pursuing connection and community with all its variations and complexities, And in our quest for justice, I think we should be really careful not to be unjust. And in our pursuit of peace, I think we should be really careful not to destroy. And in our quest for love, I think we ought to be really careful about not hating. And so pro-social to me is being an active participant in relationship with other people to solve the world's problems and our families and communities' problems, and move towards healing and integration and peace.
That's great. Thank you very much. It's wonderful.
A beautiful place to end.
Thank you both very much. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you.